My name is Matthew Sperrazza.
I'm Father Sam Kachuba.
And I'm Stephen White.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
I just went with it. Do we have to
guest.
start over?
No, it's perfect.
That
It's
was
perfect.
fantastic.
Yes.
You are the first guest in like 3.5 years to do that. Good
Yes.
for you. Oh my gosh. Forget the bio.
Yeah. That tells us everything we need to know about Stephen White. This is great.
Oh, you are going to fit
He
right in on the
understands us
tangent.
immediately.
Yes. Oh, this is so
Wow.
good. I couldn't be happier you're here. Stephen White, first of all, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
And you are the executive director of the Catholic Project. You've been directing that project, it seems, since 2019. Is that correct?
That's correct. Almost 7 years now.
Okay, perfect. Admittedly, the other place that I know you from is I've read some of your work on the Catholic thing. So beyond the Catholic Project, if we could also talk a little bit about the Catholic thing, that'd be sweet.
Sure.
But regardless, it says here, for over a decade, you have been a fellow at the Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Your work focuses on the intersection of faith, politics, and culture, frequently applying Catholic social teaching to contemporary issues. So I think, needless to say, your work is super applicable to today. And I'm curious if more people have taken notice of your work with the election of Pope Leo XIV and like the swell of people interested in Catholic social teaching. But we'll get to all that because I promised Father Sam the first question. So, Father Sam, this is me passing the ball to you.
Oh, thank
Shoot.
you, Matt. Well, Stephen, thank you for doing this. As I was saying to you before, I've been wanting to do this interview for a long time because I think that the work that the Catholic Project has done in this national survey of American Catholic priests is enormously important. And the subsequent work, so there's the initial survey and then the two follow-ups, I think they've just provided a lot of really interesting information. So before I say anything more, can you just tell us a little bit about these surveys and what you're getting at by putting them out?
Yeah. So the idea for these big surveys started probably 2019 or 2020 with an offhand remark from Cardinal Dolan, who mentioned to then president of Catholic University, John Garvey, that in the more or less 20 years since the Dallas Charter, since the bishop's first attempt to reform the Church in the United States after that first atrocious wave of the abuse crisis, that in the ensuing decades that the relationship between priests and bishops had changed. There was a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest this, that what had been a relationship between sort of brother to brother or father to son had been sort of HRified for good and obvious reasons, but nobody had taken a careful look at how much has it changed and exactly why. And so that sort of was the beginning of the National Study of Catholic Priests. It really came into execution in 2022. We had the initial survey was the largest study of American Catholic priests of its kind in more than 50 years. And it had three parts. The first was a census of bishops themselves. We sent out a survey to bishops to get some sort of a baseline of how they saw things, but also to have them have some skin in the game when we're trying to convince priests to do something that helped to say the bishops did it too. The main piece of the study was a survey of 10,000 priests in spring of 2022. And then there was a follow-up to that, which was in-person qualitative interviews with about a little over 100 priests to sort of get the why to the multiple choice answers from the bigger survey. So that together comprised the initial wave of the National Study of Catholic Priests. We published a report in fall of 2022, looking at some aspects, sort of a first gloss on the data. We published a subsequent report on that first study in fall of 2023. And then this year in 2025, we did a follow-up survey, same sample or parts of the same sample, to get a sense, have things changed in the last 3 years, but also to ask some new questions about pastoral priorities of priests and things like that. So we had the initial wave in 2022. We had a follow-up this year, and it's kept us busy for the last couple of years.
So maybe we just go survey by survey.
Sure.
That initial survey in 2022. Now, full disclosure, I participated. I answered some of the questions that came from that. So
Steven's actually got all your
Yeah, I've got them
answers.
right
he's got
here.
them
They're
queued up.
He's got the files.
fully anonymized. I couldn't find your answers if I wanted to.
I can also say I was not one of the 100 that was interviewed in person. I just submitted my answers and that was it. I wasn't even sure, like, you ever answer a survey and you're not sure if anything's ever going to come of it or you're ever going to hear about what was actually said. I was so excited to get the actual results of the survey. And I have to say, I was not surprised. There was really nothing in the results of the survey that were surprising to me, but I know that for a lot of people, they were surprising. So could you give us just like a little overview of what that first survey of priests in 2022 revealed?
Yeah. So I'll hit the main points here. The first thing, and the survey revealed a lot of challenges facing priests in the United States and a lot of things that they're unhappy about or struggling with. But it's important to begin with what I think is, I always try and make the point, this is the first and sort of top headline result, is that American priests are flourishing. Men who enter the Catholic priesthood of the United States are very happy in their vocation. By and large, they show degrees of flourishing that are above the level of the sort of general population. That's good news. That's good news for priests. It's good news for people who are considering the priesthood. It's good news for those of us who depend on our priests and want to hear some good news about them every now and then. To measure flourishing, we borrowed a metric that was developed out of Harvard University. That it's a battery of questions that we don't ask, "Are you flourishing?" But it's a battery of questions that try to get at sort of mental and physical health, spiritual well-being, a different number of factors, and there's this whole battery of questions. You can come up with a composite score. And the flourishing score for the priests in the United States averages around 82 out of 100, or 8.2 out of 10, which is higher, like I said, than the general population for a similar group of men of the same age. So that's good news. But it also showed that there were some concerning things. There were signs of elevated burnout, especially among younger priests. There were a lot of concerns about the handling of the abuse crisis. So, for example, 82% of priests said that they regularly fear a false allegation about sexual abuse, which is not surprising that that's something that priests would be worried about. But seeing that number is sort of shocking to see just how big of a part how much mental space it takes up for a lot of our priests. There were data showed that the diocesan priests tended to be less trusting of the process should there be an allegation than their counterparts who are in religious orders. And then we looked at, so we had concerns about trust between priests and bishops that showed up in our first report. Our second report looked more at a couple other things. It looked at generational dynamics. There are significant differences between how older and younger priests see themselves, how they see the causes of the abuse crisis, how they see sort of the future of the church and the relationship between them and their bishops. So we got more into some of the generational dynamics and differences in their second report. And then, like I said earlier, we re-asked some of those questions in the 2025 survey. And on a lot of those metrics, things are a little bit better. Priests are a little bit more trusting of their bishops. Not super trusting, but a tick upward in a couple points is a good thing. It's heading in the right direction. But we also got a chance to ask priests, what if it was up to you, what would the priorities for your parish, for the Church in the United States, or what would the pastoral priorities be that you would like to see implemented in the church? And it was really interesting to see, on the one hand, near unanimity about certain things, like taking care of marriage and family life is super important. Evangelization is really, really important across the board. And then, things like taking care of the poor, taking care of migrants, taking care of, care for human life at the beginning and end of life. Pro-life issues were really important. That's pretty much unanimous across priests of all ages. There were some other issues where you saw differences, though. Older priests ordained, say, before 1980, tended to be much more interested in things like synodality or ecology than younger priests who were more interested in things like Eucharistic devotion. So there were differences between older and younger generations of priests, which, again, most people who spend any time around a Catholic parish or more than one parish, that's probably not surprising. But it was interesting to see how those dynamics played out and put some numbers on them.
Yeah. I was struck when I read the initial report, that first one from 2022, I guess because I was grateful to have the opportunity to answer some of those questions, and talking with other priests, I know that it was a huge help because a lot of the things that priests were feeling were given a number. They were given a graph. There was an expression of it that was now very, very public, and it was really well known. Especially that there are a lot of priests who, while they're flourishing, they're happy, they love their vocation, they wouldn't change a thing, are struggling a lot because there's that threat of accusation. There's the threat of, man, what happens if? Will my bishop have my back? Will my bishop trust me? And what that leads to is the overall feeling of a lack of trust in bishops. And so it was good, I think, to get that word out and to just to say it out loud. And to me, it seemed like a lot of priests around the country were just taking a breath of, finally, I've said this thing that has been held within.
Yeah.
But what I was surprised by was the way it made me start to sympathize with bishops. These guys can't win.
Yeah. There's an interesting story about there's I won't say his name because I may have forgotten it, but I'll pretend like it's because I'm covering up his name. There's a priest who took our survey in 2022, and he took it and he thought, this is my chance to say what I think about about the bishop's performance, and I understand, but there's some things they've gotten wrong, and I'm going to let him have it. And then he sent the survey in and didn't think about it again for a couple months. Well, in the intervening months, he was made an auxiliary bishop.
Oh,
so then the report comes out in October, and he's reading. He goes, "Oh, come on, we're not that bad." Right. So he took the survey as a priest, but then received the report as a bishop. And he's like, "Oh, come on." Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a good insight, and that's something that I've seen too. Is that the bishops are in a very tough position. Every bishop I've talked to about this data and about our reports wants to do well by their priests. They know that their own ministry is so dependent upon their presbyterates. They want their priests to be happy and healthy and holy. They want to do everything they can to make that happen. And so I think, if we talk about what was the bishop's reaction to this survey, I think some of them weren't super thrilled because there's some data in there that points to some tough questions. But I think by and large, they were actually really receptive. They were grateful that they had a place to begin these conversations. And I've been impressed with the number of bishops who've either with help from myself or my colleagues here at the Catholic Project or just on their own initiative have taken our data as a sort of starting point for conversations with their own priests about, this is a national survey, so it doesn't give an exact portrait of any given diocese. But there are a lot of sort of issues in the report that come up that are common across the country, and a lot of bishops have been turning to their priests saying, is this something we need to talk about? Is this a problem we have in our diocese? And if so, what do we do about it? So the idea that we could have done some work that's sort of being helpful to priests and bishops and helping to begin strengthen those relationships is a really, really edifying and gratifying thing for us here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the numbers that jump out were 49% of diocesan priests trust their ordinary, their bishop, but only 24% trust the bishops as a whole.
Yeah,
so seeing that number.
This comes up a lot. The number, if I'm correct, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I think that the number is over 50% now with the 2025 data. So
yes, the 25. Yeah, it did. It jumped over. That's
but there's sort of you see this phenomenon in other surveys too. If you look at if you ask someone, what do you think of your congressman? He might not have a very high approval rating, but if you ask him, what do you think of Congress in general? Congress in general always scores much lower than my guy. So I think there's probably something similar going on with bishops. But yeah, those numbers aren't where you would want them to be. They're moving up, but I think there's obviously a lot of room for improvement. And part of it is that first survey came out in 2022. That's not that far removed from the sort of awful days of 2018, 2019.
That's right.
When that sort of second massive wave of the abuse crisis hit, and not that far removed from COVID, which was really tough on a lot of priests, caused a lot of strain between priests and bishop. So I think some of the improvement, I think, is due to the bishops, sort of responding. I think some of it's probably just sort of moving farther away in time from some pretty rough patches in the relationship between priests and bishops, and rough patches for a lot of people, not just priests and bishops. So it's good to see things moving in the right direction, at least a little bit.
Yeah, that's helpful context, because those numbers are they're a little nerve wracking. And then it seemed to me at least that there wasn't necessarily a whole lot of response coming from bishops about it. There was like an initial sort of, oh, these responses are concerning, these numbers, we've got to do something. And then nothing, sort of what's going to happen. But now you're talking about bishops having reached out to you. Can you say a little bit more about what they've done, what kinds of responses you've gotten from the bishops to start to work on these relationships?
Yeah, well, the responses have varied and it has been uniform, but in person, I've had bishops talk to me about how important the data was and how it's helping them in their ministry. I've heard it a lot from priests about how if nothing else, to sort of be able to say something and have that sort of echoed publicly mattered tremendously to them. But we've had bishops who've had us in to give clergy convocations where we present our data and the priests talk about it, and they have some very sort of straightforward conversations, often with the bishop in the room. We've had a number of those. We've had deanery meetings. They'll invite us in or come out by Zoom to present our data and talk about it with some of the priests in the deanery and things like that. There's a diocese of Fall River took our data and said, look, we're going to use this as to revamp most of our ongoing formation programming for the for that diocese. So, and we weren't involved directly in that. They came to us afterwards and said, thank you for this. This has been sort of a spur for some of the new initiatives we're taking. So the response has been generally positive. I'm sure the guys who were, bishops who were really upset didn't write me a letter and say, this was useless and I didn't like it at all. I haven't gotten any emails or letters like that. But I think by and large, the response has been positive. And like I said, for a lot of the bishops, it was sort of a reluctant, maybe not even begrudging, but a reluctant admission that these are challenges that need to be addressed. You'd rather talk about something positive. You'd rather talk about something helpful and hopeful. But like I said, every bishop I've ever talked to about this wants the best for their priests. And in places where they think conversations about these challenges are needed, they've, as far as I can tell, have been pretty good about facing those conversations and having those conversations with their priests.
So in the surveys, one of the things that I also I kind of had a sense of, but so I wasn't surprised to read it, but this idea that bishops were being seen as CEOs as opposed to like spiritual fathers or even, fellow brother priests, recognizing the difference between a bishop and a priest, right? But so like you called it the HRifying. I really like that. But like even just treating the church like a business, which is of course like an age-old trope, like the skeptic sees the collection and says like, that's why they do it, So it's not like the trope didn't exist beforehand. But how much of this is unavoidable? Because also when you get down to it, in a real sense, the bishop is the boss. Like in a very practical way, which is like he is the shepherd of the diocese, and so he is choosing where the priests go. Yes, and there's like, I'm not a bishop, so I don't know how you should do it, right? I guess that's my question. How should it be done? But like there is a certain level of communication that goes on between a bishop and priest, but how much of these kinds of feelings are unavoidable, I guess is my question.
Well, I think it's understandable that a bishop, especially in certain dioceses, would have to be an effective manager, essentially have some business acumen, or at least know enough about business to know what he doesn't know so he can hire someone who does. Most men didn't go into the priesthood, serve, a decade or two as pastors to spend the rest of their time running a multi-$100 million organization that may or may not be going through major restructuring and bankruptcy. That's not really what priests are trained for. Some of them, thankfully, have
that wasn't what they discerned.
No. And someone's got to do that. And that someone is the bishop invariably. Now, one of the things that was interesting is we asked in the 2022 survey, as you said, how do priests see their bishops? And we asked bishops, how do you see your relationship with your priest? And there was a big difference. Among priests, they're much more likely to see their bishops as administrators and things like that. And bishops much more wanted to be seen or saw themselves as shepherds. So there was this disconnect. One of the interesting things is that if you, we looked at trust, and we talked about, confidence or trust in bishops was lower than you would hope it would be. And we wanted to know, why is that? What seems to correlate with lower trust or with higher trust? And we thought, well, maybe smaller dioceses trust is higher, and it was a little bit, but not by much. The bishop is more likely to know all of his priests by name or whatever in a smaller diocese.
Yeah.
That made a little difference, but not much. We looked at a couple other things. We looked at, for example, political or theological alignment. Priests who see themselves as sort of politically aligned with the bishop or theologically aligned with their bishop tend to have a little bit higher trust in their bishop, which is sort of understandable.
Right. Feels more like your guy.
Right. You guys see eye to eye on some important things that would make sense. But in the 2025 survey, we sort of stumbled on something. Maybe this is obvious, but it's the best indicator we found for do you trust your bishop is how you answer the simple question: do you think your bishop cares about you personally? Right. So it's really a personal, and that's a way better predictor of trust and confidence in a bishop's leadership or religious superior's leadership than any of the other things. And I think this is kind of edifying. And I say that because it would be sort of disedifying if the best predictor was, do I align politically with my bishop? That would be sort of unsettling and unsavory. Yeah. But the idea that a personal relationship, a personal trust, not whether we see it eye to eye on everything politically or theologically or in any other way, but do I think that we have a relationship where I think he cares about me? Not that he does what I want him to do, but I think he cares about me. That can make a huge difference. So if we go back to a scenario, you look at a big diocese that's dealing with a lot of restructuring issues or bankruptcy or whatever, the bishop is going to have to deal with those. If he does it in a way where there's constant communication with his priests, where they feel like he cares about them, like they're not lost in the shuffle, like they're not just a piece on a chessboard or a number on a file, that can make a big difference. It doesn't mean that the bishop doesn't have to do all that administrative stuff. He still has to do those things. But there are ways to do it in which priests feel that they are not lost in the shuffle, that they're still cared for, and that even when the bishop has to make tough decisions or decisions that the priests don't like, it's being done with their best interests at heart. And so there is a way to do it without losing the confidence of your priests. Tough decisions still have to be made, and the bishop still has to make them. But I think there's a lot of relationship building that can go on before you get to those crisis moments that can make it so that in those moments of real challenge and crisis where the bishop has to put on his CEO hat, he's got a lot more leeway and sort of slacken the line from his priests who are more understanding of the job he has to do.
Mm.
I want to go on our first tangent here, knowing that we might not actually get any answer to this, but I wonder if this is so obviously it's a current issue, but is it a distinctly modern issue for the church? Like if you went back to Saint Augustine of Hippo, who was a bishop, did Augustine of Hippo have these problems, right? Was it how many priests were, I don't know, ordained by Saint Augustine, how much money did the diocese of Hippo have? I guess actually he wasn't part of that diocese. That's just where he's from. But but his diocese, how much money did they have? Is this because Catholicism? Is this an American issue?
Yeah, the question I like to pose is how did St. Peter organize the flow chart of his chancery staff?
Yeah,
right. And it's but it's underneath that there's a serious question. There's a lot of ways that the bureaucracy, and I don't mean that as a slander. Bureaucracy is important to big institutions. The way the bureaucracy of the Church in the United States was built and evolved, especially over the last 150 years. It was built and designed and evolved to meet certain specific needs that were dictated by the kinds of Catholics we had, largely urban immigrant Catholics, in densely packed communities where you had a parish every 5 blocks, and one was for the Italians, and one was for the Poles, and one was for the Irish. For a growing church, a church that is growing not only in population but is growing in wealth and in social capital. The circumstances now are just very different. Some of the circumstances are better, some are worse, but it's just very different. So if the large institutional apparatus was designed for a very different era in the life of the church, then how are we going to change it? And how does it need to change? I think those are really tough questions. Those are generational questions. And they're questions that no bishop wants to get wrong, right? There's a stronger incentive to we'll tinker and then punt it for the next guy, rather than to say, well, I'm going to shut down this big institution that's very beloved in my diocese, and we're going to try something new, or I'm going to consolidate parishes, those are hard decisions to make, and they generally don't get made until you've reached a moment of real crisis. And the question is, the church faces the challenges it faces, and those are different now in the United States than they were 100 years ago, and I'm sure they're different than they were 500 years ago in Europe, or
for St. Augustine,
1,500 years ago, 1,400 years ago for St. Augustine.
Right.
Yeah, but I would imagine that some of those relational challenges have always been present, right? Because human nature being what it is, if I don't know, if somebody looks at me cross-eyed, I think that there's something wrong, and it might just be that they're cross-eyed, and that's all it is. But I think there's something wrong. You know?
Yeah, there's also a challenge. So the massive increase in our ability to communicate across space and time today has actually, I think, in some ways made that problem worse, because the expectation for personal relationships and interaction is so much higher now. It used to, the idea that you would have, I'll tell you what Saint Augustine didn't have to deal with is a diocese where he had 500 priests and 2 million people scattered over, 100 square miles or whatever. I think the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, to use an example, has more Catholics in it than I think there are people in the country of Norway. It's enormous. There's like 4.5 million Catholics, 5 million Catholics in it. Okay. How can someone who's in that diocese feel close to their archbishop? That's 5 million. That's 5 million people. There weren't any cities that were 5 million people, let alone one single diocese. So I think our communication ability, our sort of the efficiency of modern technology can allow you to have a bureaucracy that can manage an institution, a local institution that's that big, but that comes at a cost, right? So it used to be that you could be the pastor of as many people as you can reach in 1 or 2 days walk. Right? Because that's how you're going to get to your parish, or you're going to go visit the sick in your parish, is you're going to walk there, or maybe ride a horse or a carriage. But there were sort of hard built-in limits to what could be expected of a leadership of a local church, whether it's a diocese or of a parish, just because it was not humanly possible to try and go beyond that. We don't have that now, right? We have the internet, and we have phone calls, and we have all this stuff that sort of, in one sense, expands our ability to sort of try and govern or manage or be a pastor to a place and certain people. But that stretches our abilities so way past what was ever reasonably expected of us a long time ago. And you see this interesting way. So Indiana, just to pick an example, Indiana, sort of in terms of the number of people and the geographic size of the state, is about the same as the country of Ireland. So Ireland has like 26 dioceses. I think Indiana's got 4 or 5, right? Yeah. Because Ireland became Catholic, and the dioceses, they've changed over time, but the dioceses were built for a time where the local church was much more local. You didn't have these huge, massive dioceses. Now, I think Ireland probably has too many dioceses. That's neither here nor there. But the way our things that initially would seem to have nothing to do with sort of evangelization of the life of the church, just sort of changes in technology and the habits of life that those alter. That's changed the way a diocese functions, what it can do, what it's expected to do.
Yeah.
So we're constantly changing these things that don't necessarily seem to have a lot to do with, how do we get the kids baptized? How do we get the people formed for, for their vocation to marriage or supply sacraments? But it changes our expectations and sort of the fabric of our lives in a way that we sometimes don't notice, but has huge repercussions for how the church actually inhabits a given place and a given time with certain people.
Yeah. Right. In the 2025 survey, this is reminding me, there's one of the questions that was asked was, I believe that I'm being asked to do things that I wasn't trained to do. And guys in the older age group, ordained longer, older in age, they tended to answer, no, I'm doing what I was ordained to do. Whereas the younger guys were the ones saying, yeah, I'm being asked to do a lot of things that I wasn't really trained for. And it got me thinking when I read that statistic about I remember talking with one of our retired priests here in the diocese, and he told me that he became a pastor after 22 years of priesthood. He had been a priest for 22 years before he became a pastor. Mm-hmm. And then he was a pastor for the remainder of his priesthood, just about. And I'm thinking, I'll be 18 years ordained, and I've been a pastor for 11 of those years. Right?
Yeah, I know a guy in the Midwest who on the day he was ordained, was made pastor of 6 parishes.
Yeah. And I've been a pastor a while, but I talked to some guys, and they're becoming pastors at 1 or 2 years ordained.
Right.
It's increasingly they're being asked to do things that, yes, they were ordained to do this, but they're being made pastors earlier, so they're taking on certain responsibilities they would have had more time to be sort of mentored into and trained in. Right. But then they're also being asked,
the entrance ramp is a lot shorter.
Yeah, but they're also being asked to do this in a way that has never been asked before. So you'll talk to guys who have more than one parish. They're taking on a 2 or 3 parishes, and often that involves including the not just multiple parishes, but there's also at least one place that has more than one language that's being spoken. And so now they're taking on ministry in these places. But they don't have the same number of priests available to help them. They're not being given that additional support staff. But very often in the restructuring, there's this sort of forgotten piece, which is how do you maintain all these places and keep everybody happy? Sometimes it's the priest who's sort of forgotten about. So fathers, we'll still have all the masses that you had. And there's, instead of 4 priests like you used to have between these 2 parishes, you'll now have 1 priest. Well, that's a mathematically impossible thing to do, right? Yeah. I talked to one priest out, I'm trying to remember where he's from, but he was telling me that in his diocese, they did a restructuring of parishes. And the struggle for him was that it wasn't working. It was a bad restructuring. And he felt like his bishop wasn't listening and that the bishop wasn't paying any attention and that they had just sort of pulled the trigger on this restructuring without any real consultation. And so when he was transferred, the guy who came after him had the same problems that he had had. And he thought that he was in trouble because the bishop wasn't responding. When the next guy also had the same problems, the bishop stepped in and said, okay, we have to fix this. And made massive changes, but with meetings with all the priests and with the people from the parishes and everything. And they came to this really good and healthy place. And the guy was like, well, what happened to me?
Yeah.
But then he said he had a great experience. New bishop came in, the previous bishop retired, a new bishop came in, and his new bishop was able to sit down and kind of examine the whole restructuring process and start to make those finer adjustments that really needed to be made. But yeah, we have a lot of priests now being asked to take on far more responsibility, but given less resources. Matt's tired of hearing me say this because I've said it to him a million times, but it's the Pharaoh saying, tell them to make the same number of bricks, but don't give them any straw.
No straw.
That's what a lot of priests are feeling right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the question I get asked more than any other from bishops is, are the younger priests really burned out and overworked? Are we asking too much of them? Or is there a generational problem? Is it these young millennial guys don't know what hard work is? Now, they don't always phrase it that sort of bluntly, but that's sort of what's behind the question. And it's a good question. It infuriates young priests when I tell them this, or many of them. They think they get incensed. Like, I've got 3 parishes. I've been a pastor I've been ordained for 2 years. I'm pastor of 3 parishes. What are you talking about? Right. But at the same time, there is obviously there more and more is being asked of priests, especially in regards to becoming pastors at a younger and younger age and managing a couple different parishes. But there are also questions about, every generation thinks, what's with the kids these days. But there are also legitimate questions about, and I don't just hear this from bishops who are complaining that the young priests aren't keeping up their end. I hear this from seminary formators, right? Guys come in to seminary and they're theologically just awesome. They've read all their Ratzinger and all this stuff. They're theologically on board. They love the Lord. They come from a good family. They, inculcating habits of Eucharistic adoration and Eucharistic devotion is no problem whatsoever. But there's some human issues that they don't know how to look you in the eye and shake your hand when they meet you. They have a hard time talking to women, not like to ask people out on dates, but like that's most of the people in your parish are like, if you don't know how to interact with adult women, that's kind of a problem. And frankly, a lot of other sort of human and social skills that frankly, seminaries weren't designed or built to teach. That's what families are for. So you have, and again, that's not a problem for young men who discern the Catholic priesthood. There's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that's a challenge for an increasing number of young men under the age of 30 or 35, right? So this is sort of a generational thing. And bishops are trying to figure out, what is this? Is this something we can fix? Is it something that someone else was supposed to do that we can make up for? Is this, so trying to identify where that challenge is a legitimate question. It is, as much as it can irritate the younger priests, I think that's a real phenomenon that the bishops are trying to get their head around. How should I be looking at this? Because, like I said, they all want their priests to be able to do as well as they can. And they know that they're asking a lot of them. So sometimes that means looking both at what can the bishops do better, but also, these young guys who are, signing up for the priesthood at a time when it's not real popular to be a Catholic priest and taking on challenges that older generations of priests couldn't have even considered taking on. There's also challenges for the younger generation that are on them in a way too. Have a conversation where there can be sort of a frank discussion about the challenges from both ends, so that the younger guys and the older guys are in the bishops. I think that's important.
Do you think that's
I'm really
why
glad you
one
brought
of the
up-
responses? Oh, sorry, Matt.
No, it's okay. I was just gonna say I'm really glad you brought up human formation, because one of the things that I was thinking of, you said how the greatest indicator of how a priest might feel about his bishop as far as trusting him goes is this: do you believe that you care about me? Right? Like, well, what does that mean? It's like, do you have a relationship with them? But one of the additional factors in we're talking about the difference, the distinct factors of a modern American diocese. Like we also have to accept the reality that I bet that there are, I mean, I couldn't even pretend to give you a percentage, but there's probably a huge number of Catholics whose like de facto go-to spiritual father is Father Mike Schmitz, and they've never met him. Like there's this like weird phenomena of like the internet celebrity priest who's giving fantastic advice. So like I'm not like, it's not to disparage them, of course not, but like the total lack of relationship. And that also stems from the fact that like, well, father's got 6 parishes and 10,000 families across his parishes. Like how could he possibly be a father to 10,000 people, you know?
Or how could he feel isolated with so many people in so many parishes? Well,
right.
Do those 10,000 parishioners see the parish as their community, or is it the place they go to mass for 1 hour a week?
Right.
Maybe.
Right. Is father a mass machine? You've used that phrase before, Father Sam.
Yeah. Well, and to that point about human formation, I was wondering, do you think that part of the reason that the follow-up survey indicates that pretty much across the board, priests see as a major area of priority ministry to family life, marriage preparation, youth and young adults. Do you think that's part of the reason they say this is the place where we have to help them to be formed as human beings, as Catholics, as men and women of virtue, as families, as the building block, as the first church, as the domestic church? So that's the place we have to invest this, because that will give us, going forward, that's going to give us healthier priests too.
Yeah, I hope that's the case. I mean, I certainly see it that way. As long as I can remember, in this country, you've heard about a priest shortage and a priest crisis, right? And no one thinks that we've got a superfluity of the number of priests. We don't have too many priests in the United States, right? But if you look at the numbers, after the Second Vatican Council, the number of priestly vocations dropped dramatically. The number of priests who were leaving voluntarily increased dramatically. And so you have this drop over a couple of decades, but then it leveled off. Then it goes up a little bit, a little down a little bit. But the number of priests, the point here is it's essentially bottomed out and is stable now, the number of men who are entering the priesthood. You'd like it to be growing to match the population, but it's not an acute crisis where we don't know where the bottom is. Overall, there are dioceses who are better off, worse off, but overall, the priesthood in the United States is stable. It's not in great condition in terms of numbers, but it's stable. Not so Christian marriage. The number of Catholic marriages began to fall and is still basically in free fall, if not accelerating, going back a couple generations. Where do you think the next generation of priests is going to come from if families aren't being formed, people aren't being baptized, the sacraments aren't being administered up front? So there's a lot of ways in which I think the challenges for priestly formation in the priesthood of the United States are very much downstream from the challenges of Christian marriage and Christian family. I say that I'm biased because I'm a dad with kids, but I really think that the one is very much downstream from the other. Another piece in this question that often gets ignored, there's a priest, the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, named Father John Burns, who's a great guy, and he's convinced me that there's one of the most important elements of the church historically, and in the church in the United States too, has been a robust and flourishing religious life. And we've sort of adapted to life without that, or with a truncated version of that. We don't have that many religious like we used to. And we've sort of gotten along okay and come to think that it's normal to have this sort of relatively few religious. And he would argue that for the church to really be firing on all cylinders, you need a robust religious life for a ton of reasons, not just because you have more sisters to help run the schools, although that's part of it. But it just the ecosystem, so to speak, of the church is much more healthy when you have a robust religious life, religious vocations. I like to say, like, how many challenges for the church, or for our society, for that matter, wouldn't be sort of at least partially remedied by great examples of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Right? That covers a lot of ground when you look at the challenges of American Catholic life these days. More poverty, chastity, and obedience might go a long way. So I think looking at areas, obviously there's differences between each diocese and there are regional differences. The church in the Northeast is very different than the church across the South, where it tends to be growing. But they're sort of casting a broader net and not just sort of thinking of, okay, what was the church like 20 or 30 years ago? And how do we get back to that? I think that's not the mindset. Is like, what are the long-term trends? What is a church historically supposed to have, right? Monasticism and religious life is a huge part of that. So looking for growth there, I think would be a good place to sort of look for signs of hope. We see it in some places.
Do you think that, I mean, it seems to me, I could be off on my history, but that in Europe especially, monastic life, religious life was so influential because the monasteries were centers of learning. The monasteries became the places where, depending on what we're talking about, sometimes the monastery was there and that became where the market town was. The monastery was there, that's where the first universities were. And so you have these centers of learning, centers of culture and exchange growing up around the monasteries. And so religious communities become really the backbone of the church in Europe. Whereas in the United States, because we're not, it's not a Catholic country, and we don't have a monastic history. So what you had was not that there were not religious priests who came. We certainly have a long history with the Jesuits and the Franciscans and things of ministry in the United States. But the history of the United States as a church is largely a diocesan history, a secular priest history. And I wonder sometimes if that has affected the way that we operate as like within the diocese, within these cultures as a church. And I don't know. I also think that there's a huge loss. I agree with this point that like loss of women religious is something that's really negative in the life of the church, because to have a religious sister who can go toe to toe with Father Pastor and he has to listen to her.
Yep.
When Mother Superior says jump, Father Pastor says how high, and there's a real value to that. And it
I mean,
keeps
even
a
from a
balance of
natural
things.
analogy, like mom and dad,
Exactly.
in the household.
It's a complementarity that's really needed in the church.
Yeah. Complementarity, I think, is exactly the right word.
What is the figure of how many fewer religious in the U.S. since since the Second Vatican Council?
I don't have it on the top of my head. The Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, CARA, at Georgetown, keeps track of all these numbers. And if you go to their website, they have a FAQ, because they get asked these questions so much. And they have, going back to, I think, at least 1970, maybe 1960, they have numbers for the whole country for baptisms, priestly vocations, number of seminarians, Christian marriages. They have all that data laid out.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Okay. We'll put that website in the show notes.
Yeah. And we'll put each of the surveys in the show notes too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, no, we're not going to just disregard your work.
No,
We talked about it. We don't need to.
The folks at CARA are good people. Father Tom Gaunt, they're our friends. They helped us out with some of the bishop's part of the survey that they executed for us. So we like them, and I hope they like us.
As you're looking at these surveys and all the results that you get, is there anything that for you stands out as the priority? Number one, that you would want bishops and priests around the country to focus on, as like, please look at this, please spend some time with it. And then the follow-up to that would be, what advice would you have to get something going in those areas?
Well, I think the one answer is just to, I get questions like this fairly often. I always try and avoid using the word synodality, because it just sort of changes the color of every conversation, for better or for worse or for both. But bear with me here. Audience, don't tune out. Okay, so
we're in the new era of synodality.
No,
remember,
but
Pope Leo just had the first consistory and everything. It's going to be great now.
There is a version of synodality, which I like to call just sort of Lumen Gentium in action, right? Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution of the Church from Vatican II, where you have this sense of the universal call to holiness. You have a sense that everyone, all Christians, by virtue of their baptism, are responsible for the mission of the church in different ways. The Pope and I have different responsibilities. Priests and laity have different responsibilities. Bishops and priests have different responsibilities. But we're all responsible for the mission of the church. It's not just that there are some sort of professional Catholics or clergy or religious who do the work of the church and the rest of us are sort of along for the ride. That's not how that works. We're all missionary, right? And that to work together in this collaborative way, this way of co-responsibility. I don't like hyphenated words, but co-responsibility. If Ratzinger uses it, I can use it. That means that we have to all be on board, all take responsibility for it, and we have to understand one another, which means we have to spend time with one another and talk with one another because we're engaged in this endeavor together. Okay, that's a kind of synodality that I don't know why we have to call it synodality, but that's a real dynamic that is very important for the church, especially today. It's something that you find in the church throughout history. Though we never called it synodality before. And moreover, I think it's a dynamic you find in every part of the church that's living and thriving today. Those tend to be, I think, the parts of the church that are least inclined to call it synodality, but I think whatever you call it, that reality is there, and that's really important. So I think, as applies to this data, bishops taking seriously the degree to which their own ministry and responsibility for their diocese depends on their priests and on their laity, and engaging their priests and their laity in a way that doesn't confuse the roles between laity and clergy or between priests and bishops, but helps people feel like they have been engaged in a meaningful way by someone who knows that and trusts them enough to ask them what they think about things, and has those conversations so that, again, when difficult decisions need to be made, it might not be what Father likes, it might not be what I like, but I understand where the bishop's coming from. I know that he talked to me or people like me about this before he made the decision. Doesn't necessarily make it easier to take the decision, but I understand where this is coming from. It's not just some arbitrary decision being made from a bubble. That's really important for a lot of parts of the life of the church, not just clergy assignments or whatever. So I think that kind of synodality is crucially important. Conversations between priests and the bishop, being a willingness to listen. So at least you know what your people are griping about, even if you think they're wrong. At least you've heard their gripes or their concerns or their praise, right? What are you guys doing right? It's nice to hear that sometimes. So that kind of synodality, I think, is really important.
Father Sam smiling at hearing doing something right.
Yeah, we get some things right.
The
church. So here's something that's easy to forget. In conversations like this, when we talk about the things that are wrong, because those are sort of more interesting, and we like to think that we might be able to have some way to fix them. The church in the United States is incredibly dynamic for a church in the developed world. And it's easy for us who live here to forget that there are a lot of parts of the world that look to the church in the United States and think, how can we be more like that? There are a lot of things that we get right, including, as it happens, responding to the abuse crisis. There are things we can improve on. Due process protections for accused priests being one of them. But our handling of the abuse crisis is in a lot of ways the gold standard for the church in the world. We're unfortunately, we've had a lot more experience with it than some other places, but we're in some ways decades ahead of a lot of other countries. Okay, we get some things right. The way we talk about the role of the laity in the church, it's hard to think of a place where the laity has sort of more eagerness and willingness to say things, including hard truths, to their priests and their bishops. Now, hopefully, we're respectful about it, and that we don't see the relationship between laity and clergy as antagonistic. It's not a power struggle. But I don't think the laity in the United States has been reticent about speaking up for a long time. That's not a challenge that we have. So I think there are some things we really do get right, and we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah. How much of that do you think is just because we're so dang American? we just want to get our voices heard.
Yeah. A whole conversation. Well, it's a tangent. So who ends up in the United States? I mean, historically speaking, we've sort of filled out in our sort of moving into middle age as a country. But like for a long time, the people who moved here were the people who didn't sort of quite fit or didn't want to stay in the sort of the security of the old country. Like, yeah, I'm going to go march across the prairie and dig a sod hut and start a farm. That sounds like a good idea. People who do that are a bit weird, including my ancestors, I'm sure. So I think there is I think that's part of where the American sort of sense of independence comes from, is just by default, the
we're
people
bold.
who came here were the people who wanted that.
Right. Totally. And tangentially, anecdotally, like just to relate to that, I like to tell people about my grandfather. My grandfather grew up in Italy and came to America. And he was the kind of guy who learned English at night, went on to become an engineer, and then helped America land on the moon. So like that's the kind of guy,
Yeah.
And he also at one point he was I don't know which camp he was being sent to, but he was captured with his family during the Second World War, and he was saved. There was a bunch of nuns on the truck that he was placed on, and the nuns told the soldiers, "She's our servant. She's going to help us clean the convent. They have to come with us." And so he lived with sisters for several years. He also, I also know that like they hid in caves for a while. He ate acorns. That was his diet.
Wow.
He was just starving and eating acorns. So that's the kind of guy who moves to America and then becomes an engineer at night and lands on the moon.
Yeah.
Anyway, tangent over.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. I actually like, again, I think that he would be like a great film. I want to at some point potentially hire my brother-in-law, who is a writer, to just write his biography.
Oh yeah.
But Andrew's been a guest on The Tangent. If people want to hear his story, they can listen to that episode. He's a convert. So something, unless you have more on this particular topic, Father Sam, which I'll give the floor to you.
No, go for it, Matt.
You wrote a book. You wrote a book called I have it right here. I want to get it right. Red, White, Blue, and Catholic. And this feels like a good place to segue into that book. So what's that book about?
So that book came out about a decade ago. I would say my contribution to the title, the sum total of my contribution to the title was insisting on the Oxford comma. The book it's a very short book. It's basically a primer on Catholic citizenship and Catholic social teaching. So the book came about because the fine folks at Liguori Press came to me and asked me if I would be interested in writing an informed Catholic voter guide. This is in 2014, I think. And I told them that I'd written such things before for various groups and for some bishops' conferences, and the bishops already had a document on that, and I was not particularly interested in reading such a book, and so I was not particularly interested in writing such a book. But I said it might be interesting to do a book about Catholic citizenship for the 364 days of the year that aren't election day, right? Because we focus so much on Catholic citizenship as it pertains to voting. And if you write about that, everyone wants to know, who am I supposed to vote for? And they buy the book or don't buy the book, or read the essay or don't read the essay based on whether they think you're going to tell them what they want to hear. So why don't we focus on the times and the places where most of our work of citizenship happens, which is not election day. That's important. Elections are important. I'm not denigrating that. But most of the work of citizenship happens long before we set foot in a voting booth. And so I wanted to write a book about that. And it's about family and church and local community, and what the church's social teaching has to say, sort of guiding us through thinking about that. I think it's a pretty accessible book. It's certainly not long, but if folks want to check it out, I think they'll find it helpful and beneficial. It's got a flashy red, white, and blue cover.
I would like to thank you for defending the Oxford comma. Thank you.
Much obliged.
I think that's where citizenship begins, is
decency and grammar,
decency and punctuation. Do it the right way. It's the way to go. That's how we build up culture.
I will throw in a word, a plug. So I also co-edited a book that just came out this fall, along with Dr. Brandon Vajanathan, who's in sociology here at Catholic University, and my colleague Sarah Perla in the Catholic Project. Now, the authors who actually wrote the essays in the book deserve all the credit. But it's called Rebuilding Trust, Clergy Morale in the Wake of the Abuse Crisis, an edited volume that came out from Seaway Press just this fall. It's a bit more technical. It's not as breezy a read as my short book from 10 years ago, but it's a series. We had all this data, and we had published our reports, our 3 reports over the last 3 years, But we wanted to get some sort of outside feedback, so we solicited essays and got some really interesting essays from historians and canonists and from a bishop, and looking at sort of the challenges of clergy morale and through the lens of our data, but from different perspectives. So we've got folks sort of using our data to talk about the issue from a lot of different perspectives, and I think it's worthwhile for priests, bishops, folks who work in chanceries, interested lay Catholics who they're all individual essays, so you don't have to read it through front to back. But as a summary and some additional sort of really worthwhile insights from our data, I think it's worth checking out.
That sounds great. Was there any kind of highlight that you'd pull from that as far as rebuilding trust, what it will look like? I know you were talking before about, for example, due process protection. Should a priest ever be accused? And I know that's a major concern for a lot of priests, that they won't be given a fair shake. So is there anything in particular that would jump out to you?
Yeah. So the two things I always suggest on this question are one, better due process protections. I know the bishops right now are in there every couple of years, they revise the charter. They'll sort of update it. And they're doing that right now. They've started doing it a couple of years ago, and everything with the bishops takes a couple of years. So excuse me, I know they're in the process of doing that right now. So strengthened due process protections, I think, is important. The other thing is greater sort of clarity and transparency. I know that's sort of a buzzword when it comes to the abuse crisis, but what I mean by that is a lot of priests don't know how the process works in their own diocese. Like unless something awful happens and you have an allegation against you, you probably don't know much about how the whole process works. I mean, it's outlined sort of in general terms in the Dallas Charter and the essential norms, the canonical regulations that govern such things, but it's applied differently in each diocese. And so I think each diocese going out of its way to help lay out for priests exactly what the process looks like, what they can expect from it, what their rights are before it comes to a moment of crisis would probably be helpful. A lot of priests know a guy or two guys who, have had an allegation against them. They just sort of disappear, and maybe it's a guy, I don't think there was anything behind that. And it doesn't take a lot of those stories to sort of really make a deep impression on other priests, because it doesn't have to be a lot of guys before you start to notice that could happen to me. And so I think, like I said, due process protections that are sort of instantiated in canon law. But there are other questions, when it comes to clarity. Not just what does the process look like, but there are some vague terms like vulnerable adults. So how does that fit in? It's one thing if an allegation that involves the abuse of a minor is different than an allegation of all kinds of other things we could list. So, and there's not a lot of clarity I think there's debate among candidates as to how those things get applied, and there's differences in how they're applied from one diocese to the next. So I think greater clarity about those sorts of things so the priests understand what the process is and what the law says would be helpful.
I feel like we've talked a lot about like practical realities too today. Better communication is like clearly a theme of these reports. What do you think from like a devotional perspective, right? So like, for example, like fatherhood in America has been in crisis for a good long while. And you're seeing like increased devotion to St. Joseph. And I think that fatherhood within the Catholic Church is like there's a wellspring, right? Like fathers are paying better attention, and certainly in peace that's because like we're intentionally looking at an example and we're talking about it, and so there's something really practical there. But there's also like clearly a grace that comes from increased devotion to St. Joseph, So if you were to speculate about any kind of devotion that might help a fuller, maybe the best way to say it is a fuller like lived experience of the episcopacy, like I don't know, what would you say?
Oh, that's a good question.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I wasn't sure.
St. Joseph, St. Michael, Charles Borromeo. I mean, you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. I mean, I think fatherhood, you put your finger on it. It's not just by analogy, in the sense of here's another thing. But I think there is a sense of what priests want from their bishops in a lot of cases is a father, not just someone who tells them what to do. And so that cartoonish version of what it means to be a father, but someone who leads by example, who's willing to do everything he's going to ask of his sons and more. It's easier to trust someone who knows when you know that they're going to go to whatever ends is necessary for the sake of the ones they're responsible for. That kind of leadership, that kind of fatherhood is something that we need more of. I think people these days, especially, maybe, I don't know. I think people who are in authority, like a bishop or a father, are sometimes reluctant to exercise that authority because they're afraid of lording it over other people. But there are other ways to exercise authority. And I think when someone, whether it's as a father or a priest or a bishop, does that well, really takes command where it is their position to take command, does it in a spirit of service, not in a spirit of lording it over others, people respond well. A lot of people, most men want someone to lead, and so that they can follow, and then in their own sphere they can lead, or they can learn how to lead. But that kind of leadership where can be inspiring. And I think in its absence, I think sometimes we don't have that kind of leadership out of a sense of false humility or something like that. But I think it's a servant leadership in that regard is really important.
Yeah, I like that. I think the bishops in a particular way both need to know that they have it in them to do this. Like, they have the capacity for it, but that there's also a desire for it, that their priests want it. I think sometimes the bishops are in that place of, I would do it, but the priest won't respond. My priest won't like it, or they won't be happy with it. But actually, that's the very thing that they need to do. That's the very thing that's most needed.
Yeah, it takes courage, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're putting yourself out there. You're saying, I'm going to lead, and knowing you're not perfect, but that's the job. So,
Yeah.
so do it.
So do it. That's great. Matt, do you have any other big ones here? I'm just
No
so
other
excited
big
to
questions.
highlight these
Yeah.
surveys. I think it's so important what the Catholic Project is doing. Stephen, I'm so grateful for this work that you do.
Well, I really appreciate it. We've got some other stuff coming up with the Catholic Project, sort of building off of this. We want to do a study of priests leaving the priesthood voluntarily. Anecdotally, there's been an increase in the last couple of years of young priests voluntarily leaving ministry for a number of reasons, and we'd like to know what are those numbers and why are they leaving. No one's taken a close look at this. The idea being that we can help, we can help them. We can help bishops and other priests and seminarians and seminary formators to help address this problem. We need these priests, and if we can be doing more to preserve those vocations, we should be doing that. We're gonna be looking at a bunch of. We've got some programming to help build out work for seminary, sort of modules for seminarians, so that they have some leg up in sort of administrative and management before they get sort of through seminary. But to do it in a way that's really integrated with the rest of their priestly formation. Not just here's some management skills, but like the munus regendi, like the governance of a priest, of a father.
Yeah.
You have to know how to do some of this stuff, and if you don't, you're not going to be living your priesthood as well as you might otherwise. So it's for the sake of your priesthood and for the sake of your people, let's get you some help and understanding how to do these things, or knowing enough about what you don't know to find someone who can help. So we've got a lot of exciting stuff going on with the Catholic Project, and hopefully we'll be able to do some good.
Hopefully this will be a quick thing here. Then you just said munus regendi, and that reminds me of. So back to that question about priests feeling like they're being asked to do things that they weren't ordained for. Mm-hmm. They're being asked to step outside of that competency. But do you think that also can help to sharpen what actually should fall under that category of the munus regendi, the governing office of the priest? Because I think sometimes there are things that get added to that really have nothing to do with who a priest is. But he's expected to do all these things when really those are the things that it shouldn't be him doing it. If there's going to be a munus regendi attached to it, it's him ensuring that such a thing can take place at the hands of competent professionals, not on his own. So yeah, I don't know if there's a question in there or just
no.
it's
a really, really interesting point, and it touches on so many aspects, not only of what we've talked about, but just sort of the future of parish life in general.
Yeah.
You know, an interesting thing, we got close to talking about this earlier, but you know, one of the fascinating, often unremarked realities of American Catholic life is sort of the professionalization of parish life. Right. Sometimes every now and then you'll hear a conversation about, you know, we need the church. If the church believes what she teaches in her Catholic social teaching, we should be paying, you know, parish workers a living wage. And part of me says, yeah, okay. Part of me says, no, we shouldn't be paying them anything. They should be volunteers, which is a pretty radical, shocking thing to say. And it's easy for me to say because I'm not a parish volunteer. But there is this, like, if the church has no money, does the gospel just die in the vine? The answer must be no. Right. So, you know, if you want to, it's one thing to say, how does Father get better at doing the things that he needs to do as a priest and then hire competent professionals to handle the other stuff? Okay, well, where are the funds coming from to hire those competent professionals? Because most priests don't have those resources. So in the absence of those resources, what happens? Either Father tries to do all of them for better or for worse, or someone else has to step up. And I'm looking in my screen at me, the layman, right? The laity has to understand that we have responsibility for this. It's not just Father's thing until we stop by for our sacraments on Sunday or maybe Saturday afternoon, right? There has to be a broader sense of the mission of this parish is the responsibility, yes, of Father, but also of all the parishioners here. What are we doing to make that possible? Does that mean that we give more money so we can hire those competent professionals? Does it mean that we, competent professionals who live in that parish say, you know what, I'm going to do with my retirement? I'm going to do a bunch of stuff at the parish that Father doesn't know how to do, but I spent my whole entire career being really good and successful at doing it. I'm going to do it for free because it helps proclaim the gospel, right? That's, again, easier said than done. But at some point, the expectation has to be, what are you willing to do for the sake of the mission of the church? Not what are you willing to do to be paid for the sake of the mission of the church? I say that as a professional Catholic, so I all of the objections send them my way. But I think that we have to start thinking about it in terms of that because the mission of the church has to come first. And sometimes you can do the normal, ordinary American thing, which is hire the competent people, okay? And no objection to that. But where you can't, that doesn't mean that the problems then go away or just don't get addressed. You got to find some other way around it. And as often as not, that's our problem, meaning the lay people's problem, not just Father's problem. And I think lay people getting to understand that is a big step. And a rethinking of how we think about our relationship and our obligations to not just to the church, but concretely to our parishes and to our local churches. That's a big step for Americans and a necessary one.
Yeah.
Ooh. It reminds me of Father Larry Richards. I heard him say this either in a homily or like he spoke at a men's conference I was at or something like that. That at one point, he basically he like provided requirements for his parishioners. He said, if you want to be a parishioner at my parish, you have to sign up to do 2 things a year. Like you have to take responsibility. It's not just my house, you know? And I think that's an interesting idea. I mean, what he was saying was like, and look how well it worked, you know, like that his parish was thriving, you know? So this idea of not freeloading.
It's sometimes as a dad, sometimes the easiest thing as a dad is to just like, rather than take the time to teach my kid how to do that and build up their capacity so that they can be responsible for some chore or task, it's easier in the short term just to do it myself.
Yeah.
Right. But my wife and I both, you know, we've been at this a couple of years and we know, like, take the time now, teach them to do the thing responsibly. That will make our lives easier going forward. It'll make them better and more involved and more responsible in a sort of an edifying way in the long term. And that's hard. That it's not simply delegation. It's you know, having the courage to ask more of someone and then to take the time and the responsibility for making sure that they're able to do those things well. That's a tough ask. But I don't know another way. You can't just always throw money at it or, you know, give the job to whoever is willing to show up because they might not be very good at it. And that in a pinch, that's what happens out of necessity. But I think long term, the solution has to be asking more of one another.
Synodality.
In a manner of speaking, yes.
Wow. Well, Stephen, thank you so much. Please keep doing what you're doing. It's such a huge contribution to the life of the church, and I really think it's bearing fruit, and it's going to continue to bear fruit because you're providing us with real data that makes it possible for us to confront some of these things that we know about sort of under the surface, but now we're able to bring it forward. So thank you so much for what you're doing and for making time to talk to us today. This is awesome.
Well, I really appreciate you guys having me on. This was fun. I love doing these things. Please do keep the Catholic Project in your prayers. We need all the help we can get, and spiritually as much as anything else. So appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you again, Stephen. Thanks for watching today's video. Let us know what you thought down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.